Born to earth and of the earth, we grew like infant corn among the locust clan. We gathered our dawn in armfuls of dust, we blew brainstorms in the night of our birth. Termites came and ate away our voice, ate away our rainbow's gown of flames, soiled memories with wild banquets of blood. There once were gods who came at dawn and took away our voice. Living here, the howls of storms, the screams of devotees, and the rancid breaths of priests. But those who took away our voice, they are now surprised they couldn't take away our song.
It's a deep history, an amazing one. It's not a happy story like Cinderella loses the shoe and gets the other one back and all that. This is a painful one. And it's not a story where we are dealing with fables. We are dealing with human beings themselves. So it's a story that has to be told, but we have to tell it gently and carefully. A very sensitive topic, which we don't talk about easily. You only mention slavery under certain circumstances. And sometimes you need to pour offering to appease the ancestors and tell them that we are not doing this for fun, but we are doing this for knowledge. And we are doing this as well as memory. Because if we remember you, then every year we can do something which deserves your status.
We are a very multilingual society. We don't know the numbers, so we've been floating a number of numbers of languages spoken in Ghana. So the recent one I have heard is 84 languages. We have dominant languages playing out depending on the locality.
Sana sampaya enkombo Sana sampaya enkombo Sana sangwa enkombo Sana sangwa enkombo Asina morore enkombo Morore kenama fo enkombo
You are all welcome to the slave camp My name is Aaron Azuma, the senior-most side guide of the Pikworo slave camp. This slave camp was established around 1704. The slaves would have to display themselves on the platform. Then the merchants would travel all the way the far top so that they can see all the slaves and then choose the strong ones. As for the female ones, they look at the beauty, the outer beauty.
There's a reason why Pikworo, as beautiful as it is, locals don't go in there. Because they're just traumatized many generations later. So I think when we look at our history as people who are black people in the world today, there is a lot that we have to contend with. We have a legacy of strength and resilience, but the collective trauma that many of our communities have experienced has not really been something that people have looked to try and heal.
This is where they used to stay approximately 6 weeks before they will be transferred down to the coast, like males and females. Young, strong men, as well as pretty young ladies, were taken by force from places both near and far here. People tell slaves were taken from the coast. That was the exit point. That was the exit point.
The Europeans never went as far as Pikworo, but they were quite ingenious in creating this market and the structure that allowed for a whole industry of slave catchers and people to go and burn communities down and bring people to sell. Everybody who was captured at Pikworo slave camp and kept there was not from the area.
Most of them were from the hinterlands. There we have the Moshi tribe, we have the Wangara, we have the, different Zambarmas, a whole lot. So their culture also varied.
They could come from anywhere, all speaking languages from somewhere else. So this topic you are dealing with started here, of people trying to communicate with one another.
And when I went to Assin Manso, I found, for the first time in my research, which I had done for over 40 years, I found there were tears coming down my cheeks. Although I'm an academician, I've done all that, I suddenly put myself in the picture. I realized that no, it is not a happy story, but it's a story that has to be told. So I gathered myself strength and I continued, but I had to learn to wipe my tears as well.
We have arrived here at the last bath, or the center where they were sold for the final time before they were moved to the Cape Coast Castle. The whole perimeter was used as the auctioning center back in the days. And behind me we have the last bath.
Assin Manso was a river. It was the last point for the slaves who were coming from the interior, from Asante, further on, And when they came to Assin Manso, they had their bath, last bath as it were. And then, of course, they were sent to the slave markets. That was when the final sales were done. If you look at the coast, slave castles were dotted throughout. And every castle was built by a particular European power.
These forts and castles had capacity, but not huge capacities. It's for a transient group of people who are coming in and then shipped out.
At the peak of it, the whole structure could talk of a minimum of 1,000 at a time. 600 men on the side, 400 women right in there. No matter how hard anybody would tell the story, we will never be in the position to truly comprehend what they endured.
Very, very powerful interests were involved in the slave trade. The Church of England had plantations in the Caribbean, British royal family, and other major European royals were involved. These fortresses were right next to the embarkation point on the sea. At most, you want to keep them there for as short a space of time as possible. Unload them, and let them go, and let somebody else come.
I'm sure right from the castles, people wouldn't know what language to use with one another. There's not going to be any vacuum in any setting or any domain. People will definitely have to begin to talk anyway. The answer will not be trying to learn any of their own languages. But the dominant language, that is not going to be their language, but the master's language. I'm sure the African language never came up as the solution. Although we'll be talking about what influence they had all the same, as people shifted quickly as they had to English.
When the colonizers and enslavers arrived here, they set up a system which despised our languages at the same time that they were afraid of them.
Part of colonialism was really a sense of these governments telling us that white is always superior. Our religion is better than yours, our way of life is better than yours, we're better thinkers than you.
Anybody who takes your language away from you really is trying to have you obliterated at a certain level. So the imposition of somebody else's language on yours is depriving you of continuing to use your language for your own communication, for your own purposes of development. It's a way of getting you to commit suicide.
See, that's like I always tell my friends, they always tell me, well, like I said, my name is Taylor, but that's not an African name. That's not an African name. That's a colonial name. That's an Englishman name. Taylor's an Englishman. Mackenzie, that's Scotch. So in that way, they should attend the slave master itself. That was their name, so you carry their name. Now, what you gotta find out is what your folks was, what their name was, and you don't know. You don't know. You don't know your roots.
We don't really have the record to know what exactly happened in the 17th century or the 18th century. Language can give us some indication. I mean, we can go to archives and look at archival records, but language can also give us some indication. I am not one of those people who believes that enslaved West Africans were sponges and they offered nothing in terms of language.
You know that wherever slaves have been sent to, they've left a remnant. I went to US Virgin Islands, St. Croix. Then there was an old lady who called me one day and said, I need to share my story with you. And I said, what is it? She said, I'll sing. Don't sit down there, Donko. What are you doing there, Donko? And I said, you know the word Donko? Donko is the Akan word for slave. She said, yes. My grandmother taught my mother this song, and my mother taught me, and I've taught my children. Look at women passing on oral tradition. So they have the song which they've passed on from generation to generation. And then, of course, there's the music part, the drum language, which will tell you something, the horn music. So when we say oral tradition, we're not only talking about narrative, tell the story, but also what other things are we showing? So the oral tradition in Africa has been carried on across the diaspora.
What they bring within them, you can get that out of them. You know, all right, like the drum. That's why we get, him could beat drum so good, or they could beat the drum. You know, they can beat drum.
There's a whole life of symbolism and so on that's outside the spoken word that is just, amazing.
You know, people believe in spirits. There's a song that we used to dance to with the jumping dance. A spirit walking on wire, Tule, put your foot in the fire, Tule. You know, spirit walk on the ground, ain't nobody around, Tule, spirit walking on wire, put your foot in the fire, Tule. You know, it's a good rhythm. Could you imagine a spirit walking on the wire when you come in the night? What would you do? Spirit walk in the air, walk in the day, don't care. Tule, spirit walking on wire. And you have the group in the back of you saying, Tule.
Lap that and we lap that. See, we got it right now. Going too fast. You know, Africans were brought here, through Christopher Columbus when they came in and they brought their slaves here. They bring their tradition here. It just carry on from then right into today's time. But I think it's African descent. I had some tourists from Carolina that does this type of work but out of sweetwater grass. They don't have the straw we have, but they do it out of what you call sweetwater grass.
There aren't many Caribbean people know about conch like we do. That's one of the Bahamian seafood. Other people would call it the snail. Jamaicans don't eat conch like us. In the Bahamas, I would say there's a fruit called sapodilla. In Jamaica, they call it neeseberry. We have sugar apple. They call it sweet tap. We have potato bread. They call it potato pudding. With our mutton, we cook something we call souse. They call it manish water. All right. So we have boiled fish. They have fish tea. So when you look at it, we all hail the derivative of us probably would have been Africa, and we end up different places and we just call things different names. The Bahamians has a blend with the United States out of the Carolinas. So that even added more twist to us.
We're standing on an island where we know 40% of all people of color that were taken and survived the Middle Passage, that arrived in North America, first step foot on North American soil right here on this island of Sullivan's Island. Any vessel coming into the New World were required to quarantine their cargo, African cargo, human cargo, here on this island for approximately 10 days. Then they would be taken into Charleston and to be sold as part of the African slave trade. And then now their labor, their talents, their gift, and their skills would now be diffused across the low country of South Carolina and Georgia, North and Florida as well.
My grandmother used to say that this used to be done in Africa. The ancestors used to do it. I taught my 3 sons, and my sisters, them taught their daughters.
We practice our spirituality by placing our cemeteries on the water because we think spirits move and they move back to things they like. And at one time they thought, the spirits would move back to Africa, but it didn't need, they put it there because they didn't want a barrier to the spirit. When you look at our foodways, you know that it's Africa. We got okra, what we call gumbo, and we got rice dishes. And so a lot of Africans throughout the South, the foodways are African way.
Living off of the land, living off of the water, fishing, and living in a family compound. Everyone there raising their children together on one plot of land, heiress property. And that is living in a communal way. And all of these things, unbeknownst to us, all came from West Africa, and we brought those things with us. But all of those things didn't tell me I was Gullah or Geechee at the time. What really emphasized Geechee at that time was how I spoke, my language.
When a stranger come to your door, you say, "What you come here for?" "Why did you come here?" And, "Oh, we glad for see una." "We glad una come for see we."
I don't go to mess up because one thing y'all is shout and y'all is say things up. And people ain't know why y'all saying them. They ain't know how come y'all say what y'all say, this, that, and these.
We didn't use the term Gullah that much, but they always call us Geechees. And so they say, "Oh, you're Geechee." And so then you kind of put up a little barrier because you wanted to select who you talk to, and because folks started poking fun at your talk, at your speech. There was always a wonderment. Where did our speech, why did we sound different?
As a language, it started in the slave prisons and on the slave ships because there were Africans from numerous countries who spoke numerous languages and dialects, and they had to develop a way of communicating that everyone could understand. They were also introduced to the languages of their captors, the British, the Portuguese, the Irish, the Scottish, etc.
I talked about kids laughing at my speech, and if they hadn't laughed, I'd know a whole lot more Gullah now. And if they had known what Gullah was or what the speech was, they wouldn't have even questioned me or said I was country. But as we continue to educate the public about this culture, then the public would, the outside public would then accept it. And we would feel accepted. And so that's the first education piece that must be done. We don't need to educate ourselves about our culture.
We, Papa, in heaven, let everybody honor your name because you're the holy. We pray that soon you go on rule of the we. What's the big thing you want? Let it be in this world like same like it be there in heaven. Forget the bad thing we to do, because we forget them that do bad to we.
African American English in New York or Chicago or San Francisco sounds different than the Gullah that you will hear on the South Carolina and Georgia Sea Islands or the Jamaican patois. Basically, you can attribute it, a large part of it, to numbers, to relative numbers. The South Carolina and Georgia Sea Islands are the one place where there was consistently for a long time very high numbers of Africans. You often had, 80, 90% of more Africans to white people. So their kind of isolation and the domination of black and in particular African ways of life and speaking was much stronger there as it was in parts of Jamaica.
The rhythm of it is very much like Caribbean English Creoles. And so a lot of times, my husband, for example, is from Jamaica and now living in South Carolina, and we'll often hear a Gullah Geechee speaker and assume that they're from Jamaica or from the Caribbean. So the sounds are very similar, the accent is very similar, and that's the influence of West African languages, of course, on the pronunciation, on the accent. If you were to ask Gullah speakers what they speak, first and foremost, they would say that they speak English. And so I think it's a mistake for us to sort of set it aside as something different, because it is what African Americans who are from certain parts of South Carolina speak, at least some variety of it. And it is an aspect of African American English that, seems to have played a very critical role in its early development. I mean, there's some controversy over where African American English comes from. But one side of that debate, of course, is that it was once a Creole-like variety, a Gullah-like Creole.
Stay alone. Stay alone, my little honeybee, stay alone. I'm on 1927. That's a long time. I started off as a water boy. Boss man told me I could make a little money by just hauling water, keep water to the hoe hen thing while they chop and going, people plying mules. Water boy, bring your water around. Don't like your job, set your bucket down, all that old stuff. Some of them hollering and singing the blues out there. I said, Lord, sometimes it get hot.
The blues, they got it come from America, but no, it didn't. It came from Africa. That's where it come from. When you brought the slaves in this country, you brought the blues here.
I took a course in Afro-American folklore, and I was in familiar territory. That's when I realized that the blues are really just like funeral songs among my people. You are singing out of a pain that is lodged right down there in your very soul. It is a pain that can incapacitate you, demobilize you, if you don't manage to rise above it.
Oh, yeah, man.
The funeral dirge among our people is not for the dead, it's for the living. Somehow, the pain has managed to merge or transform itself into joy. So you actually find delight listening to the blues in the same way as the funeral dirges of my people here also rise above the pain of death.
Well, I was gone on the road. I was gone a long time.
When a society enslaves people and creates a diaspora, they're putting a ticking time bomb in their culture. Because the people who you've enslaved have to be ultra creative to survive. And in the end, what they do is they create something that is not only wonderful for themselves, but crosses over to the very children of the people who enslaved them.
He said, well, I went down to the church house, fell down on my knees to pray. I got to thinking about that girl who drove my spirit away. My spirit away. Got thinking about her. My spirit away.
Hey, my boy. At 4 o'clock? Okay, then I'll be there. All right. That's my boy, he called me. He said I'll be ready at 4 o'clock. That's the one I carried away, my grandboy. I figured he was here.
My nephews and my son pick up older terminology from my parents. Like I noticed the other day, my son, whenever something went on in my house, he would say, I'll be John Brown. And that's something that my mom says all the time. I don't even know what it is. I don't even know who John Brown is, but they say it.
Give it all to me, baby.
We're from the Delta, so we have like this accent. Like, I don't know what it is, but like when we go out, people be like, oh, you from Mississippi, right? I'm like, how you know? They're like, you got an accent. But I mean, we don't hear it, so I mean, we actually don't know. We had to pick up on how we talk from someone. It might have been passed down from generations.
In the early part of the 20th century, the South was mainly rural, and about 90% of the African American population was living in the rural South. Although you had institutional segregation, say with the educational system and churches, you had a lot of people who were, there was a lot of contact between blacks and whites during that time period because of the system of tenant farming. The growth of the country store in the rural South also as the system where it was like their banking system as well as where you bought supplies and anything you couldn't grow you bought at the country store. And that was not a segregated area, so people sort of shopped together there. So you had a lot of linguistic contact between African Americans and whites during that time period. Then in the period of the Great Migration, which started around World War I and continued till after World War II, you had a mass exodus of people leaving the South. Then you had African Americans living in concentrated areas in these urban areas of the North, but they didn't have the same kind of contact that they had had previously with the white population.
In 1919, an agreement was made between landowners and landlords that they would not rent or sell to Negroes. To gradually, the population density was 4 times in the Black Belt than it was in the adjacent community. Where one family lived, there might be 2 or 3 families in the same space. This area here is the entering stage of that early period of the limits of the black community, close to the downtown area. This was a dividing line. On that side, I could go and do whatever I wanted to do. On this side, I better not come, just across the street.
You had 300,000 people scrammed into a narrow band of land at its height. So you had people in kitchenettes and piled on top of one another, commerce everywhere, restaurants, clubs, businesses, etc. And so you had a very vibrant, though repressed community. It was a very vibrant community.
For a population to develop its own variety of language, there has to be some kind of apartness. Whenever people are apart, they diverge culturally and linguistically.
A good majority of the African Americans in this community, their families originated from the South. They migrated here. I'd say 4 or 5 people that you see that be African American in this community. Probably if you go back 2 generations, their family was from the South, you know.
I have a small lemonade.
So the Southern cooking had its roots already in this community, so it was just offering what they already know.
Okay, now we're getting into another era, and this is the beginning of public housing.
They contained us within the Black Belt, and rather than let us expand out geographically, they went up vertically. Public housing literally cordoned off the entire Black Belt all the way around in a 360-degree radius. That's how hard they worked to contain us within that Black Belt.
In the first 2 decades of research, linguists were divided in their views of the origin of African American English, whether it was a Southern regional dialect descended from non-standard English and Irish dialects, or the descendant of a Creole grammar similar to that spoken in the Caribbean. Research on the language of ex-slaves showed that some of the most prominent features of the modern dialect were not present in the 19th century. African American vernacular English is becoming not less, but more different from other dialects.
We're at the site of what was once the Brewster Douglass Projects. At its peak, the 6 buildings of 14 floors apiece house 8,000 to 10,000 residents. In that context, we can see how a fertile environment for the development and the maintenance of a unique variety associated with African Americans could develop. In the mid-1960s, we did a large language study in Detroit and interviewed over 700 residents. It became immediately clear there were 2 worlds of dialects. One participated in by the white population and another participated in by the black population, most of whom were still products of the Great Migration.
As a child in the hood, it was all black. And the only time we seen white people was we went a town over and they owned the stores. Or the mailman, or the electric guy that came to fix the wires or whatever. But we didn't have that experience. It wasn't a shared cultural kind of exchange going on. We communicated with the black vernacular, with how we communicate. So you had to learn that.
In terms of what has been retained in the diaspora, I believe that a lot has, and I mean, you need to, you know, maybe some parts of the diaspora have had the opportunity, if you like, to retain more than others. So if
you are born on the continent and you go to America or to the Caribbean, what happens to you is that you kind of say, but I know this. This is something that I recognize, and it's not said in so many words, but it's just the posture and, the way you've done your hair or what you've decided to wear, or, it's just all of it, yes.
Everybody get to the dance floor for this one. We about to turn up grandma, granddaddy, grandpapa, mama, father, sister. Let's do it. Slide like this, go like this. Please don't do your toe like this.
African people, wherever they are predominantly a people of primary oral cultures. Orality here must be understood in an expanded. It is a medium in which the whole body speaks, not just by word of mouth, through body language, a wave of the hand, through dance, where the whole body becomes the medium through which language, meaning, is communicated.
One of the things, the differences between African speech and European speech is European speech, like tonight on the news, talking heads. That's it from Channel 5. What do you say, Sue? What do you say, Bob? Right? When black people talk, they get involved with the body. The body is a part of the speech event.
The whole idea of the griots coming from Africa, morphing that energy into what the preacher was doing on Sunday. Man, that was rhythmic, man, in church. To the point where the grandma was throwing up the car, praising the Lord. Do you understand what I'm saying? And then when you just at the job and somebody just starts singing, or the dudes on the corner sharing a bottle of wine start singing. There's no instruments around that. You have to have that cultural tie, that common thread that's interweaving us together. You can participate in the song, regardless of whether you can sing or not. And then culturally speaking, we even pour libation. We're going to pour this out for the brothers that ain't here. You understand what I'm saying? We don't pour too much out, but I'm saying we pour it out for the brothers that ain't here. And we are who we are. So regardless of where you find us, we have these same cultural experiences, regardless of whether we speak in Spanish, Black English, Ebonics, or whatever. There's just some things that wherever you go, you're just going to find black people participating in.
Exactly how you see these rappers from up top, our brothers up top that rap with their hands, you will find the same exact thing in Africa. It will be in dance, in talk, everything. So that expression, once again, comes right back to the source, the blueprint.
6 feet, that's 2 chains. Call your girl, she hit me back like you rang. I'm the hottest thing you sang. Mental institutions asking me, is you saying?
Some people refer to it as the dozens, but I mean, it's just this idea of like verbal one-upsmanship. You're sort of exchanging insults.
Look at the crowd, they eyes glued like they got lashes on in the draft zone. I'm with some mean boys, run up deep in the Jaheim voice, while you at the crib with your son watching Nickelodeon Teen Choice.
So I have some colleagues who actually wrote a paper where they touch a bit on humor, especially in the sense of the dozens. Your mama's so fat, how fat is she? Your mama's so fat that she could get busy, so you can go off into this thing. But you'll find that same thing, especially with Owari. So Owari is the seed and whole game that you find played throughout the continent, all the way to East Africa as Mankala and Yoruba as Ayo. And in these different locations, you have the same rules, that you can insult the other person in order to get them to think about something else, or get so mad that they, miss what they should have actually played. And the more humorous it is, the better it is to put the person off their game. And the same things that are just hilarious to us here on the continent are the same things that are just absolutely hilarious. Because I speak Tree, someone will say something that's funny and we're all laughing. I'm like, that's just like something that somebody would say like in North Carolina.
You also have, in terms of people apparently saying rude things about people's mothers and so on and so forth, which they don't really mean, that sort of thing. That's all, from here. Then there's just the gestures that we make, almost speaking with your hands, that sort of thing.
Some of those in terms of body language are things like cut eye. So if I look at you, right, that means something, right? Now, non-Africans don't even know what that means oftentimes. They're like, well, I guess he was looking, right? But, these are things that you find here on the continent, and then you also find them, in the so-called diaspora. There are things like, I made the gesture as well, sucking your teeth. So especially in the Caribbean, but then here, achi, in Yoruba, koshe. So we'll do.
People don't quite know what to call it. Some people say kissing your teeth, some people say whatever, but this sound, yeah, it's a sound of annoyance and it's a sound of irritation and so on. We all do it, and it's a very West African way of expressing, sort of irritation and annoyance. Sometimes you also it's like you got to be kidding.
That particular gesture is used widely across the New World, but it has no relationship with anything you have heard in English, in French, and the other languages in Europe. It's obvious that must be coming with the people. The meaning is clear and it's universal. Allied to that is the cat eye. Where is that one coming from? It's obvious that it wasn't coming from any of the European languages. So if at least those two are obviously uniquely African, then we cannot ignore other linkages. The picture we have in Africa where people move into public space, because then they have no mastery of the language out there, they carry whatever they were doing in their own language into the use of this new language. Evidence abound where the initial features brought into the language persist. Like the cat eye thing. Why was it though abandoned? It was never abandoned.
If you look at various elements, part of it is because, we never stopped being African. We weren't sitting around in classrooms being instructed on the Queen's English. Africans who were kidnapped, stolen, taken away from this place, and when they were taken, they still retained, their core language that they think in. The words will be, quote unquote, English, but then the way that I'm going to use it is going to be consistent with how the language is supposed to be used in my, what's really my mother tongue. You can look at various examples such as resumptive pronouns, right? There was a song called Tennessee by Arrested Development back in the day. We were like, Cece, she went down to Holly Springs.
She went down to Holly Springs. Razadon and Baba, they went down to Peachtree.
So you mention the name and then you mention she. You mention the name, then you mention he. And you'll find that, in contemporary African languages, that same thing is done. Syntactically, we'll have a final locative. So you're like, where's she at?
It's a pretty good city, you know what I mean? It's just all about where you decide to locate yourself at.
My sister, she take over my mom's business on Broad and Meeting Street. That's where she at.
So the at is a locative. And in Chi, you say, himfana wa. The wa is a locative. In Yoruba, nibolo wa. The wa is a locative. In Wolof, funek. Like, where is he or she located? Funek. So like these are things that you can definitely see in both places where it would be like, oh, that's incorrect English. No, that's correct African. In West Africa, people still pour a libation, surprise, surprise. And then even on the block in LA, let's pour out a little bit for the homies, yo.
So that's the beauty about it. The way they're behaving, the way they're using the language is very systematic and is bearing out the patterns, the footprints of history. That's what culture is all about, cultural inheritance. You do things, but you don't really know exactly why.
Slavery has affected the whole world. Not only slavery, but the whole world has been affected by our culture. The African culture, that was to every part of the world, has been affected by our culture. I mean, it is an incredible story.
African languages have had what impact on languages of the diaspora, but the reverse is also true. The influence is happening both ways.
People are indebted to, African Americans as, as the various forms of music have evolved. They've also evolved here, and people have picked them up.
And round Kwana Matesi, yes, you win Kunumango, Bonomatia, Kwanafi, Kwana, even who said, or Batis, a woman down one for your Funomajuana Makuma to who sent me Siana Sami Kumana Semi so, and I meet me da, every meet me Didi, and permit me Jari, I was Santi Fili, Sam, believe it, or Bana me Penedo, Mihuna me Hopo, or Soriana me Koto, Makohuna Bushia for Missy Castle, Papa, Mihuna me Bomba, Pepe, from Balagatanga to Kumasi, Bantuma, me crack one tinte. The African American culture has had an impact on the whole wide world. You could go anywhere on this green earth and you will find us being represented with soul. You hear presidents of America use terminologies that come straight out of, the hood. So it's no different. It's worldwide. Of course, home is home because this is home. This is where my brothers and sisters come from. It's home. This is the blueprint.
Every African American who has an opportunity to visit the continent should come, because they will find answers to questions they didn't know they had. It's a way to revive the pain that we carry if we engage in the continent. African Americans should come to various countries and start to feel like they belong here.
The most isolated individual in our communities, in our neighborhoods, in the diaspora. Everyone carries so much of us. And there is a library of knowledge in those heads, a lot of knowledge in there. You know that saying, you can take me out of Africa, but you cannot take Africa out of me.
I'll be broadcasting live from the land of the original man. Extend my hand, grab the mic, and rip a rhyme for my friends. Rhyme compositions written in my red blood. My rhymes flood my cranium, instigating my whole soul to unfold again. I'm breaking them down till it's broken. I can't close, I'm open. I speak my mind and keep my mind spoken. Same time I'll be hoping that the ill-bred head will leave the gun down on the ground and act like the chosen. 1, not 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, or 10. When the sun shines, I begin. Where true I'ma win. The man above is love. When I sin, I sin. He don't strike me out though. I guess he understands I'm just not in tune in. Yes, I begin. And round kwana matesi ya si wuni kunu mango. Bunu meti ya kwa nafi kwa linguistic.